To reiterate where we were when we ended class last Wednesday, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in which Abraham Lincoln was pitted against Stephen Douglas, the incumbent Illinois senator in Washington, D.C., the most powerful United States senator, the most powerful Democrat in Congress. It was always going to be an uphill fight for Lincoln because Illinois was a strongly Democratic state that controlled the state legislature, and that's who determines who gets to select the United States senator in the state legislature. Therefore, Lincoln and the Republicans needed to win the state legislature. It was an uphill fight. In the debates, Douglas painted his opponent and all Republicans as abolitionists, dangerous radicals bent on war and racial egalitarians. He challenged Lincoln on the stump to come out and declare whether he believed whites and blacks were equal or not. And Lincoln didn't take the bait. He acknowledged what I firmly believed was in his heart and was in the heart and minds of most whites. And that is that in the 19th century, they did not believe whites and blacks were equal in all respects. But to Lincoln's credit, he did reiterate his anti-slavery sentiments, in which he countered Douglas's attacks or attempts to get him to be very clear in coming out for black inferiority or a white supremacist view. Lincoln didn't go to the extreme that Douglas and Democrats did. He did acknowledge that he believed that the slaves should be justly rewarded economically for their labor. Again, statements will be made on the stump in which Lincoln declares whites are more superior than blacks have always been leveled against him by his critics, who will claim later as president he had no true intention on emancipation. He was not an anti-slavery man. He's being guarded. My reading of Lincoln is he's a politician, a very astute politician. He's being very careful in these debates. Now, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, there is some significance. Even though Stephen Douglas will win, and he was always looked like he was going to win, the Republicans will make some gains, but they will not capture the state legislature, and therefore Douglas will be reelected. And coming out of the election, winning again, he is set up for the 1860 presidential election, which Douglas has made known he firmly intends to run. He's like the presumptive nominee, the victor of the Democratic Party. But coming out of the debates, even though Lincoln loses, he wins in some respects. There's significance. He gains national recognition. For 2 full months, newspapers across the country reprinted the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He proved that even though he lost, he could hold his own. I mean, really, had he lost in a straight-up fight? Not necessarily, because the state legislature was always going to get to determine who would be the United States senator. He proved that he could hold his own against Stephen Douglas, and he emerged as a strong, moderate voice within the Republican Party. What I mean by that is, Lincoln does not sound like an abolitionist, no racial egalitarian, no extreme part of the Republican Party on one wing. However, he did counter Douglas in a hostile crowd, which played up the white supremacist views that Douglas promoted. Lincoln let his anti-slavery sentiments be known. He didn't totally go down to what Douglas was trying to force him into one of the two extremes. He straddled a middle-of-the-road approach. And as a result, he's not too conservative, although he is conservative, do not forget, when it comes to slavery in the South. He looks at the Constitution and says, I can't touch slavery. But he doesn't sound like an abolitionist. He takes a middle-of-the-road approach, and it's a moderate. And that might be important should 1860 come around, and should there be a presidential election, and should the Republicans get divided between, do we want an abolitionist or a conservative on the ticket? And should that present a problem for them, and one was to look for a moderate, Lincoln might be the guy. Coming out of Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln is cagey. He knows he's gained national recognition, and he doesn't want to lose it. So in 1859, his supporters began to push his name among the Republicans. He puts out brief autobiographical sketches to introduce himself to the voters. And in 1860 begins to make moves towards running for the presidency, or to announce his intention to run for the Republican nominee as president in 1860. In 1860, he pays a visit to New York City early in 1860, February. Goes to the Cooper Union Institute to give a speech. This is a place where political speeches were made by the leading Republicans and Democrats of the day. And there in New York City, he was formally introduced to the people of the East. The elites of the Republican Party were there. And even though Lincoln had made a name for himself in Illinois, and even though he had made a name for 2 months fighting against Stephen Douglas in the 1858 race for the United States Senate, the people in the North, in the Northeast, east of Appalachia, had never seen Lincoln. And this was his auditioning. And from outwardly appearances, people weren't impressed. They were not impressed. Because they observed him as he spoke. He seemed uncomfortable. His arms were flailing around. Lincoln didn't know what to do with them. He wasn't a comfortable public speaker in the sense yet. His clothes looked ill-fitting. His hair looked not perfect. And his voice, people commented on, this is a frontier man, a backwoodsman, not a refined, educated, articulate voice. He was seen as backwoods, frontier. No matter what he could do, he couldn't polish himself up. Even his supporters couldn't polish him enough. However, if you listen to the speech, forget about the appearances, his speech was impressive. His Cooper Union speech was a history of what the Founding Fathers had said about the issue of slavery. He outlined all of what the Founding Fathers had said, building towards an argument that he argued the Founding Fathers were anti-slavery. Or even if they owned slaves, they had taken steps to bring about its extinction, whether through freeing slaves upon their death or the death of their wives, or in Thomas Jefferson's case, taking steps to block the future spread of slavery in the North, which Thomas Jefferson had done in the late 1780s. He went on to speak in what I would say that was a sort of Act 1, Part 1 of his speech, was his history of slavery in the Founding Fathers. Part 2 and Part 3 were intended to speak to the South and to speak to the North. To speak to the Northern Republicans in the room, and then to speak to an imaginary audience that wasn't there, Southerners. To put Southerners' fears at ease, that he had no intention of eradicating slavery in the South. He takes his conservative position. But when he speaks to the Northerners, he has a moderate position. Not an abolitionist, but more moderate, stressing his anti-slavery. He's being very careful in crafting a sort of moderate position, as much moderate as he can, within the the polar extremes of the Republican Party, the radicals, the abolitionists on one side, and the conservatives on the other. It is a carefully calculated speech to position himself as the leading moderate in the party. And heading into the presidential election of 1860, the Republicans have two powerful nominees, one who's a conservative and one who is a abolitionist radical. And Lincoln's trying to position himself in the middle. Should these two become combative and the party can't agree, he might just be a possible backup. So the Cooper Union speech is Lincoln auditioning before the Republican Party, and proving that he could be a suitable candidate. Also, he gives a history again of the Founding Fathers and slavery, arguing that they were against slavery, that they were making moves in their time, pointing to many points in the historical record that the Founding Fathers were moving toward the extinction of slavery. He probably exaggerates some points, indeed he does, but again, Lincoln scores points. Appearance-wise, people aren't impressed. But when you look at his words and what he's saying, he's starting to turn some heads. And Cooper Union was just enough to get the taste of Lincoln on the tongue of Republicans, and enough to make them think that if their first candidate couldn't get elected, Lincoln might be their second candidate. We'll pick up the election of 1860 on Wednesday.